Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. Today, Lena Einhorn joins us. She is the author of the book called A Shift in Time. And today, we're going to be talking about what led her to the conclusion that Jesus is placed in the wrong time in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the Gospels placed Jesus in the AD 30s during the reign of Pontius Pilate. Pilate reigned as the procurator of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. But Lena Einhorn here claims that that's actually incorrect. In that reality, the Gospels moved him back in time. In other words, a shift in time. And that in reality, he was actually alive well past the reign of Pontius Pilate, more like in the AD 50s, early AD 60s, as the Egyptian false prophet. The Egyptian false prophet was at the Mount of Olives, according to Josephus, fighting the Romans, just as Jesus preached at the Mount of Olives in the Gospels. And Paul, when he's ministering in Acts of the Apostles, Acts mentions that Paul was actually confused with the Egyptian. So that being said, Lena Einhorn, I pass the mic on to you. Tell us, what led to your conclusion? What started your journey into concluding that Jesus was Egyptian? What are the most important points that you can think of?
Well, if I'm to tell the story, it's actually a sort of interesting story. I would say like this: it started actually many years ago. It started in the early '80s, and it started with something that is not part of a shift in time, but it is part. It's part of my earlier book, The Jesus Mystery is called in English. I've avoided that issue in A Shift in Time because it's so huge, or I would say it's so provocative that it sort of takes your eyes off of the more intricate details that are in A Shift in Time. But I'll tell you the story. So it started with a dinner in the early '80s, and someone at the table just said, Jesus didn't die on the cross. And I, it was like just somebody just said it. And I just went, oh, and it went like a flash, this is, my knowledge of Christianity was basically from school. We had in Sweden, we had Christianity then as a topic in school. And so, but a lot of it made sense, with him surviving the cross, Pontius Pilate washing his hands, all of those things. There was something logical, and in fact, this as I found out is a common thing. It's been written through the ages as a hypothesis that Jesus didn't die on the cross. In any event, after I sort of go through this very, very quick thought, that makes sense. I thought, okay, he was like 31, 32, 33. What happened after that? And so, one of the things that's also fitting is that, okay, he didn't die on the cross. He shows himself afterwards after being resurrected, and then he vanishes. So where did he go? So, okay, he must have had a deal. This is all fantasy, it rolled very quickly in my mind. So he must have had a deal and he left the country. Okay, so what happened afterwards? To make a very long story short, I started thinking about Paul. It's really weird that the first time Paul shows up, he's outside of the country. He's on the road to Damascus. It's right after the time that Jesus was said to have been crucified. I started thinking, could there be a connection? Could they even be the same person? So this is how the whole thing started. This is early '80s. I just had a thought and I left it. I didn't think about it. I mean, religion wasn't my field. But I had it in the back of my mind. And at one point about more than 20 years later, I have an MD PhD. That's my background. But I shifted my career into filmmaking and writing in the late '80s. And I was at a point where I was thinking, okay, what am I going to do next? I was standing in the bookstore. I lifted my gaze, and I saw that I was in the religion department, the Christianity department. Suddenly, just to me, okay, I'm going to explore this thought. So I decided to explore this thought, the similarities between Jesus and Paul. And I didn't have many expectations around it.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the way I sort of approach the issue. What are the similarities between Jesus and Paul? Now, when I started approaching it, I did what everybody else has done who's been looking at the historical Jesus, basically looking at Josephus, because he's our main, almost only source outside of the New Testament for, parallel source, clearly historical source, whatever one thinks of Josephus, he's a historical source, and he's the historical source. So I started, from the beginning, I started reading Josephus. I started reading texts about Josephus, comparing to the New Testament and all that thing. So I started noticing something, of course, very early that everybody else has noticed, reading the historical texts from that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that outside of the New Testament, there's really no evidence of Jesus's existence before the next century, the second century, outside of Testimonium Flavianum. Testimonium Flavianum is a paragraph in Josephus that talks about Jesus. Now, Josephus wrote around the same time as the gospel writers. Okay, he wrote in the 70s and the 90s AD. So this paragraph is the only thing, in that century that outside of the New Testament that talks about Jesus. And, it's I don't have to go into the whole deliberation about Testimonium Flavianum, but most people think it's not original. It's either been, either a complete falsification that came later, or it's been adjusted. And there are lots of reasons for this, but I would say that's a majority opinion, that it's not original. In any event, so the problem is, if you take that away, Testimony of Flavius, there's nothing. Okay, so this is really strange, because Jesus, as he's described in the New Testament, is very much part of the era. And it's a very well-documented era, not only in Josephus, but mainly in Josephus. And Jesus is very much part of that story. I mean, the big dignitaries of the era are there. You have the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, you have Pontius Pilate.
I think this would be a good time to add the PowerPoint to the stream. And this is one of the things you were talking about in your book. One of the PowerPoints you worked on.
Well, you're jumping a little ahead here, but I'll get to that. This is the issue of the robbers. Okay. So basically, the problem with the New Testament, and everybody who's been doing historical Jesus studies come to this, that you don't find him outside of the New Testament for another whatever, to the next century. And that, of course, is problematic, because it's a very well documented era. And so most scholars will say that Jesus was less well known in his own time than the New Testament, portrays him. And the minority holds that he's a fictional person. He never existed at all. The mythicists, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So it's obvious. But what I started seeing when I was reading Josephus and reading about Josephus is that something really strange started. I started seeing something really strange, and that is that a lot of the descriptions in the New Testament of events, of historical events, don't fit with Josephus. They're in the wrong time, or they are applied to people who are completely different than. So it started with a very simple anomaly, which is Theudas. The description of Theudas, an early rebel, who's described obviously in the New Testament being in the wrong time. is described as being soon after the crucifixion of Jesus. He's described as a person that a rebel basically, and he's known in the 30s. And Theodas is a known rebel also in Josephus. But Theodas in Josephus was active in the mid-40s under Fathers.
Mhm.
So this is a very well-known chronological aberration, and but there were more and more of these as I started reading, and I can list them. The thing you put up before, robbers. Okay, so robbers. Jesus is crucified with robbers. Okay, and Jesus is supposedly crucified in the time of Pilate and Caiaphas. Now, this is how chronology is established in the New Testament, or at all in that era. It's established based on the names of dignitaries. Okay, so if it's in the era of Pilate, then it's between 18 and 36 or so, and that John the Baptist started preaching in the 15th year of Tiberius, right? And so there are a lot of signals that are attached to dignitaries. So we know that based on the chronology of the New Testament, he would have been crucified sometime around 30 years, a few years before, a few years after. Not after Pilate vanishes, okay, which is 36, 37. So in any event, he's crucified next to robbers. And there's a lot of talk of robbers in the New Testament. But when you look at Josephus, there are no robbers in that era. There are plenty of robbers in Josephus, but not in that era. In fact, that is an era completely devoid of robbers. You see robbers who, by the way, are rebels. In Josephus, the robbers are rebels against Rome. So you see the robbers up until from when the Romans sort of occupy until the year 6 with Judas the Galilean and that uprising. And then you see no robbers. You see basically no robbers mentioned at all until 44, and basically from 48 after the death of Agrippa I. And then you see more and more and more of them, and then it virtually explodes during the Jewish war because they are rebels. So there's another thing here. So this doesn't fit. So how could he be crucified with robbers if there are no robbers, according to Josephus? Same thing with crucifixions. You don't see them at that time point. Same thing with a conflict between Samaritans and Jews. So here you see also that if you look at the New Testament, there's clearly animosity between Samaritans and Jews. Now you could say that the animosity is all the time, but if you look at the descriptions of Samaritans, you don't see it in Acts. You see it during the times of the Gospels. You see this animosity. Now, in Josephus, there's animosity between Samaritans and Jews, although it could have existed all the time. It's only mentioned in one particular era, and that's 48 to 52, which is when there is a war between Jews and Samaritans. So, and again, there's a shift. All the time it seems to be a shift about 20 years later. But I kept ignoring this, like everybody ignores it. I kept ignoring it. And it wasn't like I was looking for it. It was more like it was disturbing facts. And I'm only mentioning a few of these things now. There are lots of other things that didn't seem to fit with the time or didn't seem to fit with the named individuals. I'm listing a lot of them in my book. I mean, this is just a few of them. And in any event, I ignored it until late one night. I had been reading about this spiritual rebel leader called the Egyptian. And you have to remember that in Josephus, there are no Jewish rebel leaders named or even mentioned in that era that we're talking about when Jesus was active. It's a quiet time. And Tiberius says that it is a quiet time. Or no, rather, it is said that in the era of Tiberius, it was quiet. So this is Tacitus' statement. In the era under Tiberius, all was quiet. So in Josephus, there are no spiritual messianic, which are usually rebel leaders, mentioned at all in that era. But there are rebel leaders, messianic leaders, mentioned in other eras. And there was one who really grabbed my attention over and over, but he was, of course, in the wrong era. And he was called the Egyptian. I don't know, should I read? Do we have time for that? Should I read what Josephus writes about the Egyptian?
Yeah, please.
So he writes about the Egyptian extensively. He was one of the prominent messianic leaders of this. And this was a very turbulent time. I mean, this is why you have all these robbers, all these rebels, because it's the time before the Jewish war, after the Roman occupation. So he writes about him in both Jewish antiquities and the War of the Jews. So I'll just read one of them. It says like this: "There came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city and at the distance of 5 furlongs. He said further that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down. And he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were fallen down. Now, when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers." Felix is the procurator at that time. So he was like Pontius Pilate, but in a different era. "Now, when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them and took 200 alive, but the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight, but did not appear anymore." So that's the description in antiquities, and in war it's similar, but more negative, and it adds the information that this messianic leader got together 30,000 men and led round about from the wilderness to the mount, which was called the Mount of Olives. And the battle then is described in a similar way. So, it has to grab your attention. It would have, if it had been in the 30s, we would immediately say, that's really, there are a lot of similarities to Jesus here. I mean, first of all, they came from the wilderness or the desert. Both of them, both speak of tearing down the walls of Jerusalem. You see it in Luke. Both had lived in Egypt. And here's another issue that we can talk about when he came back from Egypt, Jesus. Both are described as messianic leaders with a great following. Both are perceived as major threats by the authorities. And the Egyptian is defeated on the Mount of Olives, which is where Jesus was arrested. Okay. Now, so there are similarities. Late one night, I come across I don't speak Greek, but I came across the translation of the description of Jesus's arrest in John. And the description of Jesus's arrest on the Mount of Olives is different in the Synoptic Gospels and in John. Because in John, it says that with the people from the Jewish council, there was also the captain and his, well, depending on how you translate it, it's the captain and his soldiers, the soldiers and their officer, different translations. So in John, it's not only the men from the Jewish council who are coming to have him arrested, but there's also the soldiers and their officer. But when you look at the original Greek, the word for the soldiers is spera, and the word for their officer is chiliarchos. Now, a spera is a Roman cohort of a paper strength of 1,000 soldiers. So 1,000 soldiers, and the chiliarchos means a leader of 1,000. So 1,000 soldiers, or at least hundreds of soldiers, are coming to the Mount of Olives to have Jesus arrested. And suddenly it looks very much like a battle, just like with the Egyptian. And then you connect this to the fact that Jesus in Luke tells the disciples when they go to the Mount of Olives from the Last Supper that they should bring swords and sell their cloak if they don't have any swords. So, and you have other indications, of the swords on the Mount of Olives. Obviously, if you go by John, he wasn't just arrested. There was a battle. And suddenly, it was when I read this, it just went wham. And then came another thing, which I sort of avoided in this later book, but I have it in the first book, the Jesus Mystery. And that is the fact that the Egyptian is mentioned in the New Testament in Acts 21:38. And the sentence, and remember what made me start this whole project was this Paul Jesus comparison. And so what does it say in Acts? It says that when Paul returns to Jerusalem and enters the temple, he's being recognized, and people are really, really angry at him, and they try to kill him.
Yeah.
And he manages to, with the help of a Roman commander, is taken out. And Jesus says, according to Acts, to the commander, I think he says, "Can I ask you something?" And the commander says, "Oh, you speak Greek, then you are not the Egyptian who went into I think he says, went into the wilderness with how many, 4,000 Sicarii or something like that." I don't have the exact quote. So basically he says, so you Paul, are not the Egyptian. And the interesting thing that I find, and I would say overall, this is sort of an overall thing after I kept, and there are so many pieces to this puzzle that I haven't mentioned, but to me, the New Testament really looks like a history book with a cover up, or with a layer, written in two layers. A history book which has to tell two stories at the same time. A religious story, the story of a messianic leader, but also true history. And the New Testament is by no means the only spiritual tome from ancient times that does this, combine the writing of history with religion, with canon, with a religious text. But the problem is that sometimes history doesn't fit into religion. And so the historical aspects is sort of submerged under the religious text, but it is there. And when you when you actually put them together, the historical text, in this case Josephus, with the New Testament, you have to, in this case, then shift it in time. Suddenly it's sort of like the pieces of the puzzle fit into each other, and there are so many hints in the New Testament that we sort of ignore, like, oh, so you are not the Egyptian. I mean, basically all the main messianic leaders of the first century are mentioned in the New Testament, but their names are just thrown in there.
We have a super chat from.
It's like what?
We have a super chat donation from S Stock. Thank you for the $4.99. His question for you is: could the Egyptian be multiple characters in Josephus? I find this connection intriguing. I bought both of Lena's books yesterday.
Okay. If the Egyptian could be multiple characters in Josephus or multiple characters, no, in Josephus is claims to be history. It doesn't have this claim to be both history and religious text. The question is if he's several people in the New Testament. I do think that the New Testament is extremely intricately written, and people do appear. So let me give you an example, okay? So one of the really, if you are to compare the Egyptian with Jesus, there are differences, right? So the first difference is, okay, Jesus was the first difference is, of course, the time. It's the wrong time. There's a 20-year time difference. So if we eliminate that, then the second difference is Jesus is just arrested. He's resting, and he's arrested according to the New Testament. And in Josephus, the Egyptian, is defeated in the battle. Now, so we have put that to rest also, because according to John, it seems to have been a battle. But then we have the big difference, and that is that according to at least Josephus, the Egyptian was never crucified. He just vanished. Now, of course, Josephus could have missed this crucifixion, but he does share this thing with Jesus that he vanished after the fight, okay? Because Jesus was crucified, resurrected, and vanished. But the question is, and here you have it, if we assume that the Egyptian and Jesus is the same person, you start seeing, if you read between the lines of the New Testament, you get all these kinds of hints. So what happens when Jesus is crucified? Okay, so he's crucified between two robbers. But before then, there's a choice between two people to crucify: Barabbas and Jesus, okay? And Barabbas, obviously, is not crucified. Who is Barabbas? Barabbas is a robber. He's a rebel. He's a rebel leader, okay? So unlike the robbers who are on each side of Jesus, Barabbas, who is the leader of the robbers, escapes. Okay, what does Barabbas mean? Barabbas means son of the Father.
Yep.
But in one of the Gospels, Matthew, I think, his full name is Jesus Barabbas. So the name of Barabbas is Jesus, son of the Father, okay? So Jesus is crucified, but Jesus, son of the Father, escapes without crucifixion. So so here you have, I mean, it's like when you look at it with new eyes, you see all these kinds of sort of things that are put into the text that really should make you think.
One of the other things you brought up in your book is the Toldeth Yeshu.
Yeah.
You brought that up, but there's another text read by Amilo.
Yeah. Let me bring that up. Yes. Yeah. So Amulo, Bishop of Lyon in the 9th century. Okay. So the question is then, what are our other sources of Jesus? Well, obviously we have church fathers who wrote about Jesus. There's plenty of text, although it all starts from the 2nd century. But there are sort of texts that are sort of a little bit outside of this, and also within this that have other information. I mean, the first one obviously is Celsus, who's really early. He's 2nd century, fairly early. So when is exactly? I think this is a few years since I did this. I think it's 180 he writes. something like that. In any event, so we know of Celsus, who was really anti-Christian, because Origen quotes him, and he describes Jesus as a man who basically had a Jewish mother and a Roman father by the name of Pantera, who comes from poverty and goes to Egypt to basically survive, and comes back with all this magical knowledge from Egypt as an adult. So he describes Jesus coming from Egypt as an adult. There are other sources that are, you have the Talmud, which is later. It's like 5th century, 6th century. So there you have also a character believed to be Jesus, not least because he's called Ben Pantera, son of Pantera, which was the same name as Celsus calls him. But then you have clearly Christian, and it also describes him coming from Egypt as an adult. But then you have Christian sources where you see it, and one of them is Amulo, Bishop of Lyon, who wrote in the 9th century a book called Letter or Book Against the Jews to King Charles, where he stated that the following was the name that the Jews gave to Jesus. I quote, "In their own language, they call him Usum Hamitzri, which is to say in Latin, Dissipator Egyptius, the Egyptian destroyer." So this is from a Christian source describing what the Jews called Jesus. And also in Sefer Toldot Yeshu, which is sort of a caricature gospel, you could almost say, in this case from 1705, the name of Jesus' father is said to be the Egyptian because he did the work of the Egyptians. There are several other sources where Christian sources where the issue of Jesus being regarded as somebody who came out of Egypt is sort of talked about in early sources. So there is support for a connection, not only Jesus as a child coming from Egypt, but as an adult coming from Egypt. And there is also support for this, by the way, in the Gospels. Because remember that Matthew describes how Jesus comes as a child from Egypt. And right after that, immediately after that description, he writes, in that time, John the Baptist started preaching in the wilderness. Now that makes no sense, right? Because they're the same age. So how could Jesus come as a child from Egypt, according to Matthew? And at that time, John the Baptist starts preaching in the wilderness. Obviously he's not a child when he's preaching in the wilderness. And so my conclusion is that if there was a shift in time if the real Jesus was in the 50s, and there was a shift in time in the Gospels to the 30s, we can talk about why they would have done this. But what I'm talking about here is how was it done? And I believe it was done in two ways, either from the beginning or retroactively. I think in the case of Luke, it probably was done in the beginning, but this is an example in Matthew where it may well have been done retroactively. I mean, they sort of changed the names of the dignitaries so that it would fit him coming back as a child after the death of Herod the Great. But it becomes illogical because if he's coming at the same time as John the Baptist starts preaching, it's impossible that he came back as a child. So that's some of these adjustments, chronological adjustments, could have been done retroactively after it was initially written, and therefore there are all these illogical things that come out.
So why do you think it was done?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say, before I come to that, I want to say that I read the New Testament as an amazing history book. And it doesn't only tell the story of Jesus and his disciples, which, if he is the Egyptian and his followers, basically is a messianic rebel leader, which makes sense, is crucified as rebels were crucified. But I don't see the New Testament telling only this story. I see the New Testament telling the story of the whole rebel movement, because there are segments in the New Testament which are much later, which are not pertaining to Jesus, but they are still there in the New Testament. And you see segments which are very, very similar to segments described from the Jewish war. And this is my conclusion, really, that it is written as a history book of the Jewish rebellion, underneath the story of Jesus and his disciples. Now, why would they, to answer your question, why would they have moved it from the 50s to the 30s? If this was done, I can think of only one reason, and that is that there were things in the true history that did not fit so nicely with the image of that one wants to portray of a religious leader, a godly figure. And that is all the stuff that happens in connection with the rebellion. I mean, it's a violent era. It's violence. I mean, the Egyptian went out into the wilderness with Sicari, according to Acts. The Sicari were violent. I mean, they were the knife men. And the fact is, and I really do think, because there are lots of indications that Luke read Josephus. I mean, there are many people who have attested to the similarities between Luke and Josephus. Yep. And Josephus, you must remember, was a really well-known person in that era, and he was brought to Rome. He was an aristocrat. He was a leader of the rebellion, not a rebel leader. He hated the rebels, and he befriended Titus, and he came, to Rome as an aristocrat. And he decided that his mission in life was to save to posterity the history of his people that he assumed was going to die out, be lost after the Jewish war. So he took it upon himself to write the history of the Jewish people. And he did it in 4 books, and mainly for our purposes, 2. And it's not one book. I mean, it's a series of books. Jewish Antiquities is, I think, 20 books, and the Jewish War, 7 books, I think. In any event, this was his mission. And so he became the official chronicler of the Jewish people and of the Jewish people in the Roman era. He wasn't the only one. There was, for instance, one called Justus of Tiberias, but his stuff is lost. But I mean, there were depictions, and in Josephus's book, there is a description of these rebel leaders and of the Egyptian, which is not a nice description. It's not a very pleasant description. I mean, basically, he calls him in war, he calls him a charlatan, basically. And he definitely describes him as someone who wasn't crucified. So what do you do if you want to distance yourself from this description? And his books were deposited in the Library of Rome, and he even had a statue. What do you do? Well, either you compete with that description, or you move your tale to another era where there is no competition. And this is the only reason I can think of why they would want to do a thing like that. And if it is like I perceive that, for instance, Matthew has been time adjusted retroactively rather, then it was originally written in the right era, but afterwards adjusted to be a different era. And the only thing you need to do in order to adjust it to another era is to change names of dignitaries. That's all you have to do, because the dignitaries signify the era. But if you don't do other adjustments, you get these funny things, like you get robbers in the time of Pilate when they were not active.
We have another super chat from Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners. Thank you for your $2. His question for you is: was Jesus initially a follower of John the Baptist within the framework of your theory?
Okay, so here we come to another. I'm glad for that question, because I haven't talked about John the Baptist at all. So with John the Baptist, you have the same thing. You have a paragraph in Josephus talking about John the Baptist. Now, that is not universally regarded as a later addition or a falsification, as much as Testimonium Flavianum is, which is the paragraph that mentions Jesus. The paragraph that talks about John the Baptist is by some considered an interpolation, a later addition or change. I think it is, but in any event, there's another person here that Josephus writes about, who's not called John the Baptist, but I will read to you about this other person. Now, this other person was the last rebel leader named by Josephus before the Egyptian. Okay? So Josephus talks about plenty of messianic rebel leaders, but he names only a few. And so the Egyptian was a major messianic rebel leader. The one he names before the Egyptian is Theudas. We've already mentioned Theudas. He's mentioned in the New Testament. Remember, throwing in names of rebel leaders for no apparent reason? He's thrown into the narrative of Acts. But this is what Josephus writes about John the Baptist. Now, listen carefully. Now, it came to pass, while Flavius was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Flavius did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who, falling upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive and cut off his head and carried it to Jerusalem. Now, if you had called this guy John the Baptist, that would have been the end of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was gathering disciples by the river Jordan. The dignitaries, the person in charge here, Procurator Flavius, sends out people, cut off his head and carries it to Jerusalem. You just change, again, you change the name of dignitaries and you come to a different era. So you can change Herod Antipas for Flavius, or rather the other way around, and you come to a different era. So this is a description that is so similar to John the Baptist, and it is the last major messianic rebel leader before the Egyptian. Now, he's not, if the question was he a disciple of John the Baptist? Now, the interesting thing is here that when you start reading the New Testament through the lens of Josephus, you see, as I said before, it's not only a story of of Jesus and his disciples. It's the story of the whole Jewish rebel movement against Rome. And so when he mentions these people, they're not necessarily connected in time. And and obviously we don't know when we know the Egyptian came under Felix, which is from 52 and forward. And we know John the Baptist was killed under Flavius, which was around 45, 46. So obviously there's a gap there of 7 years. We don't know if the Egyptian met Theodos or was even in Judea at the time of Theodos. And it's not necessarily so, because as I said, the sort of purpose is to tell the history, and doing it through this a narrower lens of Jesus and his disciples. So that's the answer.
I do want to return to something that you talk about in your book, the Jesus mysteries. You were talking about parallels between Paul and Jesus.
Yeah.
You make out Paul and the Egyptian to be the same person.
I suggested. I'm not making it up. I'm giving it as a suggestion.
Okay.
But Paul and the Egyptian and Jesus, basically. Yeah.
Assuming that is the case, that Paul is the Egyptian who is Jesus, what is Paul claiming to see? Because in his letters, he claims to have visions or revelations of a spiritual heavenly Jesus. Is he having some sort of mental issue or something? Is he really seeing himself, or is he having hallucinations of himself and he thinks it's a different person? What's going on there?
Okay, I want to say two things. With regard to Jesus and Paul being the same, and with regards to Jesus and the Egyptian being the same thing, and the whole time shift, I feel very certain that this is accurate, because the evidence is, it's multifold. What do you say? Manifold. There's so many things. It's like, frankly, to say, if you look at the New Testament and Josephus in the 30s, there is not one single thing that fits, both action-wise and time-wise. Not one single thing. And if you look at it broadly, it's basically the census under Quirinius, and that's not in the 30s, is the only thing that sort of fits time-wise with between, the census was really under Quirinius. So you don't find any parallels. This is the disturbing thing when you look at the New Testament, Josephus. You see the names. The names are the same. Many names are the same, but they don't do the same things. So, but when you do the time shift, I mean, there's so many parallels. It's like everything fits. I mean, it's many parallels that all fit into the picture. It's really like putting two puzzles and nothing fits, and then you put it here and it fits. So I'm utterly convinced about the time shift. When it comes to Jesus and Paul being the same person, I will not say that I'm as convinced. I think it's a nice hypothesis, and that's why I put out the argument for, and I put up the argument against in the book. Now, so that's what I want to say. First of all, that I find it being an intriguing hypothesis, and it's really linked to the time shift by the fact that so you are not the Egyptian question being posed to Paul, which is really a beautiful way of saying Jesus and Paul is the same person, because you don't know that the Egyptian and Paul is the same person if you just read the New Testament. So it sort of creates the link. It's this historical quiz almost that you find in the New Testament. It's beautifully written. Now, is he mental, seeing visions, whatever you were saying? I don't know, and I don't think that is so important. But what I do think is that what is so provocative with the thought of them being the same person is really that Paul would be tooting his own horn. I mean, that's provocative. So you have to remember, this is an era where everything is destroyed. Okay, it's the end of the Jewish realm. It's and this is, and I believe the time shift applies to Paul as well. So that becomes that's a further discussion. I don't think we have time for it. You'd have to read the book for that. But basically, we are in the era of the Jewish war, and he's active mainly outside of the Jewish realm. And so when he starts spreading this new religion, which it really is, and it really, what he's doing is he's spreading Judaism to the Greeks, to the Gentiles, but in a way that's more palatable, because you don't need to get circumcised, and you don't need to practice all the rules. You don't have to eat kosher food, all those things. But it is really a transfer of the religion of the Jewish realm that is being destroyed to the rest of the world. He's doing what Josephus is doing. He's making this religion survive, whereas Josephus was making the people survive. So this is sort of Paul's mission. But it, to me, he is really, if Jesus is the Egyptian and he is being defeated, then he is taken out of the picture of the messianic Jewish leadership, but he's also taken outside. He vanishes. He leaves the battle. He leaves the catastrophe. He leaves the realm. He goes outside. And when the destruction inside is finished, there are still people on the outside that maintain sort of the Jewish history and the Jewish religion. And this is, in a sense, this is what Paul does, and this is, in a sense, is what Josephus does. But if Paul and Jesus is the same person, then it becomes a little complicated, because he is tooting his own horn.
So we got 2 more super chat questions. S. Stuck, thank you for the $4.99. His question is: Josephus and Saul Paul seem very similar. What do you think?
My think is why? Why is Jesus and Paul seeming similar? The person would have to say why Josephus and Paul is similar. I mean, Josephus, okay, he travels outside of the country, but he doesn't. I mean, he's not not spreading the gospel of any religion. He's a historian. He's mainly in Rome. I really don't see the similarities. I don't.
Next one is from Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners. Thank you for the $5. Following your argument that Jesus reemerged as Paul, wouldn't Paul's issues with P and J refute this, since they obviously knew who Jesus was?
What's P and J?
I don't know.
Are those the disciples? Oh, Peter and okay.
Peter and John, yeah.
Okay. So this is interesting, because what did I do in the early 80s? This is a really good question. What did I do in the early 80s? The first thing I checked before I put it to rest.
Hold on, he's saying it's Peter and James.
Yeah, Peter and James. So it's the disciples. Okay. So what did I do in the early 80s? I did exactly this. I did exactly that, the question he put there. I went and I checked. Did the disciples ever meet Paul after Jesus's ascent to heaven, crucifixion, after he vanished? Did they ever meet Paul? Because if they met Paul, they should have recognized him and seen that this is Jesus, right? And I immediately saw, yes, they met Paul, of course. He came back to Jerusalem. They met Paul. Okay, so I put it aside. This was the early 80s. And I I didn't do anything with it for another 20, 25 years. But the interesting thing is that, again, you have to read between the lines. It is, yes, they would have known that this is Jesus coming back, and they didn't. They weren't happy with him coming back. It's very obvious. They were trying to get rid of him, and finally, when he did go to the temple and he's discovered in the temple, people try to kill him. So it's not like, and he describes that as dividing up, who preaches among the Jews, who preaches among the Gentiles. Obviously, Paul was not really welcome to come back to Jerusalem. So yes, if Jesus and Paul is the same person, obviously they knew that this is the same guy coming back.
Well, I know you only had 1 hour of us, and I appreciate you for coming on. So I think this is just about time. I thank everybody for the super chats. Those are great questions. Lena, thank you for your answers to those questions. We should definitely do this again sometime. I want to do a show focusing more on your book at some point. The Jesus, the Jesus mysteries. Yeah. Okay.
I should say, what is the difference between these two books? I think it's important. The Jesus mystery is really more of a popular book. It's sort of, I wrote it as I did the research. So when I said I had this revelation in the middle of the night of John writing that they were a cohort of 1,000 soldiers, I was 2/3 through the book. So I was making the discovery as I was writing. Now the Jesus mystery is sort of a broader comparison, and I'm making the discoveries as I'm writing. Really, I really am. And the final 2 chapters deal with the issue of Jesus and Paul, and the time shift comes along as I'm writing. Whereas the second book, A Shift in Time, which came in 2016, is completely focused on the time shift. And in it, I am putting forth, it's more academic, not entirely. It has all the background history, but I'm putting forth all the evidence for the time shift really taking place. I'm leaving the issue of Paul aside because it sort of takes over if it's there, but it really focuses on all the evidence for there having been a time shift between from the 50s to the 30s, basically.
Well, thank you for joining me, Lena Einhorn. But like I said earlier, we should definitely do this again. I enjoyed this stream, and I thank everybody for watching. I thank you for the comments, the super chats, everything, the wonderful questions, and I want to thank you again, Lena, for answering those super chat questions. Those super chats help keep this channel going. Well, until next time, everybody, and don't forget, tomorrow I'm hosting a debate between Daniel Unterbrink and David Merce. Give that a watch. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.